Hey everybody, welcome to Sunday Morning Conversation. Today, my guest is Dr. Ramesh Raghupathi. He is a neuroscientist at Drexel, and he focuses his research on traumatic brain injuries. He didn't have a lot of time today to talk, so I tried to do my best to really ask some of the really important things that I wanted to ask. But if he had the time, I could have certainly talked to him all day long about traumatic brain injuries. And I learned a lot today. I hope that you can too. And, maybe he and I will get back together again in June when he comes down to it for his conference in Atlanta. So thanks again, everybody. I hope you get something out of this. I really liked it. So thanks for tuning in.
Good morning.
Hello, Doc.
How are you, Eric?
Another day in the life. It's a little dreary down here in Atlanta. How's it up there in Philly?
Oh, it is very, very dreary this morning. I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but last night when I heard on the news, they said it was supposed to be snowing and just wet, but it's just wet. There's no snow. So
Atlanta doesn't really get much snow, so
yeah.
When it does, it shuts down our city.
So are you in the city?
Yeah, I am.
So there is, I will be coming to Atlanta in June.
Okay.
The National Neurotrauma Society has its annual meeting in Atlanta this year.
Where at?
Good question. It's probably some hotel, but let me confirm that for you.
Usually places like that go to the Marriott. It's this big, weird-looking hotel.
Probably. Let's see. It's the Westin Peachtree Plaza in downtown Atlanta.
Okay, so the Westin is this bit. All right, when you fly over Atlanta, the Westin is this big cylindrical building that's one of the tallest buildings in Atlanta.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, it's glass. It's hard to miss. It looks silver from the air.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you know about the Neurotrauma Society?
I know a little bit about it.
Okay.
I mean, I was reading into it. By the way, your bio, when I was reading through it, for somebody with a TBI, it's actually a lot easier if you flip it from black text on white background to white text on black background.
No kidding. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, like when I'm browsing stuff on the internet, I always flip it to that to make it easier to read.
Oh, yeah. So the bio that's on my website is the university thing. So I just give them the information, they put it up on there. So
yeah.
But I have to say though that that my web presence on the Drexel website needs some serious updating.
A little bit of an overhaul, huh?
Yeah.
But no, I don't know a whole lot about it. Why don't you fill me in on the blanks?
Yeah. So this is a society that is the representative professional organization for faculty, research clinicians, and researchers, and who do traumatic brain injury research and spinal cord injury research. And it was established about 30 years ago as a national neurotrauma society, but it also included a lot of faculty researchers from around the world, and still does. And then about 20 years ago, the international membership decided that they also need a separate society. So there's an international neurotrauma society. Now, the bulk of that membership is clinicians. So it's the focus of the International Neurotrauma Society meetings, which is held once every 3 years, is much more clinical, translational, and talking about everything from acute care of TBI patients to chronic rehab to and then there's basic science involved. The National Neurotrauma Society is a lot more focused on graduate students, postdoc trainees, and sort of the animal preclinical research in spinal cord and brain injury.
So you said the first one was held every 3 years. In between each conference, is there like a lot of big advancements in the field in that time that there's a cover? Like, do you think that's too too long of a frequency in between conferences?
No, so the National Neurotrauma Society, the meeting that's going to be in Atlanta, is held in the United States every year. So it's once a year. Now, to answer your question, the National Neurotrauma Society also has a journal called the Journal of Neurotrauma, which comes out twice a month. So 24 issues a year. And that's sort of the platform where, as you point out, the major advances, both clinical and basic science advances, can get published.
Okay.
And within this age of social media, both the publisher and the society will highlight, major, important publications and important studies on social media. So, people are aware of what's been done.
Yeah, you get a lot more exposure with social media than you did just back in the day submitting it to journals. Because only everybody in your field saw it, and with social media, you have a chance to get it picked up by a broader audience.
Yeah.
So, what made you want to get into TBI research?
So I did my PhD in biochemistry, doing something related to arthritis and inflammation back in the middle 80s. And I was in Richmond, Virginia at Virginia Commonwealth University. At that time, Virginia Commonwealth University was one of the, I would say, 3 major centers for TBI research. The other 2 at that time being UCLA and University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Now, in the last 30 years, that there are many more places that have University of Miami, University of Kentucky, University of Texas in Houston, and University of Utah. Those are just a few examples of big neurotrauma teams and spinal cord injury teams of faculty. Now, so when I was finishing up, and I was a biochemist and a molecular biologist, not working in the brain, neuroscience at that time in the 80s was just a very, very small field and an upcoming field. Now it's a much larger field. And the TBI research was very much focused on sort of behavior and neurochemistry. So just looking at chemicals in the brain. And there was not a whole lot of molecular genetics and molecular biology types of work that was being done. And I'm not kidding. This is my entry into that. So my lab, the lab that I was in doing my PhD, we would go out once a week on a Tuesday afternoon, and I think it subsequently changed to Tuesday evening, like 4 o'clock, and go to the gym and play pickup basketball. We would just, there were 5 or 6 of us in the lab, and it was enough to play 3-on-3, for example. We found out then through that there were a couple of people who working in the neurotrauma and the TBI field upstairs in the same building as my lab was, who were interested. So they joined us. And so I became good friends with them, and played basketball with them for about 3 years. And as I was getting towards the end of finishing up my PhD, I was talking to them, and I was like, you know what? And, I'm looking for opportunities to do something, research as a postdoctoral fellow. And what you guys do sounds interesting, and looks like there's a gap that I can fill in coming in as a biochemist and molecular biologist. And literally, that's how I applied to a couple of places that were doing TBI research. One of them was at the University of Connecticut. And I got an offer to join the lab as a postdoctoral fellow. And that's essentially my entry into TBI. I came in to do molecular biology. That was the first part of my postdoctoral fellowship. I was doing a lot of looking at genes in the brain that are changing as a result of TBI and trying to ascribe some functionality to those changes.
What do you
And then
like
some-
about it? Well, I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt you, but
No, go ahead.
what do you like about it? What keeps you coming back day to day and doing it?
You know, what I like about it, and this, again, this is another, what you find is, as when neuroscientists try to figure out over the years, like how the brain works, this was the days before we had any sort of imaging and any sort of way to see the brain, you know, in the head. The only way they could do it was to use behavior. And so, and the only way they could determine what part of the brain controls what behavior was to go in and lesion that part of the brain, you know, maybe take a scoop out of it, maybe stab it, maybe do something, and really cause brain injury to say, okay, if I stab this part of the brain and cause this part of the brain to be injured, the animal can't do this, right? And so therefore that part of the brain must be why this behavior happens. That coupled with evaluating brains of patients who had very specific disorders and physically looking at their brain once they passed away, gave people the idea of functionality. And so if you flip that back, we're essentially doing the same thing, except in the case of TBI, the brain injury happens and now there's a problem. So to me, I'm using I'm using this idea that the injured brain has a consequence in terms of behavioral problems and how we fix that, and how we, at the same time, we can also understand the complex circuitry of the brain. That's sort of my driving force here, you know. So while I'm on the one, my one foot is in the camp of trying to help the patients and trying to fix, potentially coming up with ways to fix the behavioral issues that TBI patients suffer from. And then the other foot is in the camp of being a neuroscientist and trying to figure out and contribute to the, bigger picture of how the brain works.
Yeah, a story of Phineas Gage, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I remember learning that a long time ago when I was an undergrad.
Yeah.
So what are some of the biggest, I guess, findings that you've made personally?
I would say one of the things that I first started, one of the, we knew that when you had a severe TBI, that brain cells, neurons died. And maybe that was part of the cause of why certain behavioral problems happened. So the next question was, how do these cells die? There's a number of different ways that cells can die. Now, and each method of death has a certain biochemical event or certain set of biochemical events that take place within the cell that cause the cell to die. And so my first effort was trying to figure out how these cells die, what are these biochemical events? And we did that. Are you familiar with the term programmed cell death or apoptosis?
Yeah.
Necrosis. So the whole idea there at that time, this was in the early 90s, was, well, you're injuring a mature adult brain, so the only way the cells can die is by necrosis. So we started to say that's not necessarily the case. The biochemical pathways that control apoptosis do take place and are present in the mature brain. And so part of my original contribution was to identify first in humans that, first in animals, that apoptosis was taking place. And then subsequently, in a series of about 4 to 5 papers, we demonstrated the same phenomenon in severe TBI patients in postmortem tissue from severe TBI patients. So that was one contribution. More recently, over the last, I would say last 15, 20 years, we've had some substantial contributions to pediatric TBI research. So research in causing TBI in the infant population, still a very understudied area. And importantly, demonstrating that even though physically the pediatric brain that is injured looks like the adult brain, the cellular mechanisms that lead to that damage are not the same. So which means if one were to develop an intervention, a drug or intervention that could work in the adult, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in the child. And we've sort of shown that in sort of over multiple studies. And then my recent efforts, when I say recent, I'm talking the last 7 to 8 years, have been to focus on concussion type of injuries in adolescent animals, because we all see the football players and the soccer players, professional players getting head injuries, but that's not they don't start getting the head injuries at that point. They start getting the head injuries when they were middle school kids, starting to play the sport that they are going to get, professional in. And so, so to understand at the level of the middle school, high school age, how concussions affect the brain, and particularly because the brain is still developing at that point. And then we, and sort of as a result from those studies, we started to detect differences between the sexes. And that's a huge thing. I mean, even so, in the case of moderate to severe brain injuries, 1 in 4 patients who suffers as TBI is a woman. But if you go down into the adolescent age group and start to look at concussions, girls are 2.5 times more likely to sustain a concussion than boys are.
Why is that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it's partly because girls' sports are becoming a lot more physical. So, and when I say 2.5 times more likely, I'm talking about the sports that both boys and girls play, not so football doesn't come into the picture. So if you add football in, then clearly that's mostly a male sport. And so there are more boys that suffer concussions from football. But if you take football out of the equation and you look at sports like soccer, baseball, softball, lacrosse, volleyball, basketball, the games are becoming a lot more physical, and people are becoming a lot more muscular and strong. So when impact happens, it does lead to concussions. It does lead to injuries. There's a lot more injuries, not just of the brain, but just of the whole body, that orthopedic clinicians, orthopedic surgeons have been reporting for the past decade now, in the younger age groups. So that's one reason. The other part of the equation is the fact that girls take longer to recover from concussions than boys do. They also exhibit slightly different symptoms. When they get those symptoms, it's a little delayed compared to the boys. So it can be argued that it's a slightly different disease in the girls than it is in the boys.
That's only in adolescence, not in adulthood.
Right now, yes, that is the case, but it's not. The only reason that we don't have that kind of information in adulthood is because there's not that many clinical studies that have been done in that older population. But now I will tell you that one reason, this is not the only reason, and it's not even an important reason, but it is one of many reasons why clinical trials for TBI, for moderate to severe TBI, has failed, has not been successful is because a lot of the preclinical work has done the drug development research in male animals. But then when they move into the clinical studies, by law, you have to include both men and women. And so when you include the women, their responses to a lot of the drugs that are not the same, metabolism of the drugs, the efficacy of the drugs are not the same as in men. So it kind of it changes the picture a lot.
So in a way, it kind of skews the results.
Skews the results, and unfortunately skews the results into a negative, saying that the drug doesn't work. But there's not enough statistical power to say it works in men but not in women, and vice versa.
Okay. So are there any other findings that you've personally made that have been kind of intriguing?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, so a lot of my recent efforts have focused on, so there are two other things. The initial work in TBI, not just mine, but the initial, and even to this day, a lot of people still buy into this idea that we've got to start the drug treatment immediately after injury. What is not being taken into account is the fact that over the last 60, 70 years, the number of people who die from a TBI has substantially decreased from, it used to be back in the 50s and 60s, used to be up in the 50%, 60% range. Now it's more like 20 to 25%. The reason for that is not because fewer people are getting TBIs. It's because there are protections in place. So, for example, motor vehicle accidents, airbags, is one contribution. But even with that, the other significant contribution is the clinical management of these patients in the emergency room, in the ambulance, in the emergency room, has substantially improved. So the clinicians now know what it is that they need to do, either from a critical care standpoint or from a neurosurgical standpoint, or both, to keep the patient alive and facilitate survival. What we don't know is, sort of the longer term. And so my research now has started to move more into that realm. And with that, the story that we are trying to create now, we published 2 papers recently along those lines, where we basically said that the intervention should happen at the time of the testing of the behavior, right? So it's not that you're going to fix everything right away. In fact, I don't have convincing evidence. I have anecdotal and circumstantial evidence that if you come in with some sort of a pharmacological intervention, meaning a drug treatment immediately after injury, there's a very good likelihood that the repair response that the brain mounts in response as a consequence of the injury could be impaired. So what you're doing is you're potentially interfering with that natural recovery, with the recovery process. So maybe we need to give the brain a little bit of time to adjust to that new situation of being injured, and then come in and help, rather than coming in right away. So that's sort of the overarching hypothesis, if you will, that drives some of my projects today.
Yeah, actually, with my TBI in particular, we didn't do specific drug treatment until about 2 years in, when the neurologist, I don't know if you ever heard of her, her name is Dr. Angela Ashley. She works with Emory. But she prescribed Aricept and Namenda to put me on. I don't
Mhm.
know if it actually made a difference or not, but those were the two
Right.
that she put me on.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, that seems to be more and more, I mean, so understandably, you know, one of the one of the um, underlying issues with that kind of an approach is that you're treating the symptoms, right? So there's always this balance between, should we treat the symptoms or should we have a disease modifying intervention? And so the idea of coming in immediately after the injury or very soon after the injury with a drug or with a bunch of drugs is more focused on, we want to modify the course of the disease. We want to not even allow the brain to get to that level where it's going to have this chronic impairment. Unfortunately, I think that the evidence for that, the from the lab work would argue that that approach isn't very effective, because some of these changes need to take some time to develop before you figure out what can be targeted.
I would agree with that because being on those two drugs, I don't feel like they made really any difference.
Right.
But well, that's
Well,
very,
that's a key point there. It may not have made a difference to your condition, but trust me, those drugs are working. They're doing things, other things that you may not experience, sort of what, for the sake of a better term, let's call it side effects. But there's nothing like an inert drug, right? So it's making changes that you may not experience right now and may not affect your daily life from a negative side of it. But clearly, it's also not giving you the positive effect. And so essentially, you're putting drugs into your body that maybe you don't need to be putting in.
yeah, that's definitely very true, Doc. I never really thought of it that way. But yeah, so what's the future of your research looking like?
So I think that's sort of right now, the two big pillars that my research is standing on are this idea of sex differences and the idea that interventions have to be targeted to the behavior that you're testing, and targeted time-wise at very specific times, preferably in the chronic phase after the injury. Um, and so I think those are the two sort of avenues that my research is walking down right now.
The last question, because I don't want to take up any more of your time, because I could talk about this with you all day long. Do you believe in the idea of the damage that TBI survivors have as permanent? Like, could it always be improved, or is there a limitation to where, like, you have the law of diminishing returns, where this is the best you're going to get? There's a little bit more you can get, but it's going to take a lot of effort. But there's still a permanent issue where you can never really be fully rebounded.
I don't buy into that, and only because I don't think we've ever really tried harder to make sure that we completely reverse. And the thing about it is to keep in mind that you may have physical signs of damage in the brain, but that does not in any way suggest that functionally that the brain can't recover, meaning there's enough plasticity even in the adult brain that you can have a restoration of function despite having that big physical sign of injury. The other point I would make to that is a lot of our efforts, and I'm guilty of that too, because, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, but a lot of our efforts as basic science researchers are focusing on what I would call monotherapy, meaning one drug that fixes everything, right? I know that that's not an achievable goal, but at the same time, it's not that we don't want to get to the situation where where a patient is going to be taking 10 different pills a day at different times of day, right? So what are the other opportunities that we have outside of pills, outside of drugs? And so those are things like cognitive behavioral therapy as an example, physical therapy, I mean, like exercise therapy, things that are, you know, uh, can facilitate plasticity in combination with the drug, right? So we might, it's that balance that has to be created. So we haven't explored that to the fullest extent possible to be able to say that you, as the TBI patient can actually get back to pre-injury functionality. I think the limitations that you are talking about right now, or you brought up, are focused on the limitations of the approach using drugs, pharmacology.
And we can build new neural pathways, right, through learning, and that we can build.
Not so much build, but strengthen.
Okay. Now, like, because man, I do forget where I heard this from, but oh, it was an NPR short podcast. There was a doctor over in London. I forget where it was. It was James Godwin, I think it was. He has a book, I think it's called Supercharging Your Brain. And he says you could strengthen your neural pathways by doing like learning new things, rather not like doing those brain games on your phone. Those don't really do anything for you. That's just kind of occupying your time. But for instance,
but it makes you play those games better the more you play it. That's all.
That's true. Yes. But like for me, things I've done is talk to people like you, because that helps engage me and keep me focused, attentive, talking to people that I find interesting and I want to be hanging on every word. Never mind my cats wandering around in the background, but learning that way, or the YouTube, I watch a lot of YouTube and they're learning related channels. So I feel like that's helped my cognition a little bit there. So I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're doing is sort of like your homegrown version of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Engaging, and it's sort of the sports analogy that I would put to this is playing different sports so that you may not be a star, but at least you're engaging different parts of your body, right?
Cross training.
Cross training. So, I have two sons who played sports as they were growing up. I coached a lot of the sports that they played. And one thing that I never believed in was that they play one sport their entire life. So they would play until even well into high school. They played basketball in the winter, soccer in the fall, baseball in the spring, and then sort of a little bit of baseball and basketball in the summer and summer leagues and things like that. So it kept different parts of their body, active, depending on the sport that they played, as opposed to a lot of the current focus is on, oh, my daughter is going to play soccer 12 months out of the year and nothing else, because that's what it's going to be, or play baseball, nothing but baseball. And sure enough, you're going to cause there's a greater likelihood of ending up with both, orthopedic and nervous system injuries as a result of constantly just using one motion and one group of muscles, if you will.
Yeah, I'm actually a triathlete, so I do swim, bike, run throughout the week.
There you go. That's it. That's it.
Well, thank you, Doc. I do want to make one suggestion for you while you are in Atlanta in June. The Westin also has a restaurant on the top floor. It is a revolving restaurant, so you can see a view of the whole city. Their lunch menu is usually better than their dinner menu, at least the last time that I went there, like 5 or 6 years ago. so you
Sure.
can get a good view.
Yep. I mean, if, let's stay in touch, and if you're able to meet in person in June, that would be great.
Oh, Doc, I have plenty of availability. I should be around.
Great. I will be in touch as we get closer to the meeting date, and we'll set up a time to meet.
Oh, that would be perfect. Thank you, Doc, for joining me today.
Not a problem. It was great to talk to you, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any more questions or comments.
Beautiful. Thanks again.
Thank you.